So we are here today to talk about Herbert Marcuse, a radical Marxist from the 1960s who was very influential to the left in the United States and really across Europe. And I thought we would start with a quote. "Not every problem someone has with his girlfriend is necessarily due to the capitalist mode of production." This quote just shows Marcuse's kind of humor, obviously, and he's known for being a Marxist and therefore for looking at capitalism as a mode of production, as how we produce our everyday living in relationship to the cause of problems across the world. And here we're talking, of course, about different forms of oppression. He would look at fascism, Nazi Germany, as a form of capitalist production. Obviously, he would look at the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the Soviet Union, as a different kind of capitalist production, but still a capitalist production. And writing in the 60s and 70s, his focus is going to be on the capitalist mode of production in the United States and within Western Europe. So I just want to look at Marcuse's life and introduce who he is to kind of prepare you to read his material and to think about what he might contribute to our studies and how we might question what he has to say. To begin, I want to just go over his biography. He was born on 19 July 1898 in Berlin and died 29 July 1979 from a stroke while visiting Germany. So he had a fairly long life, and it was in the most tumultuous time of the 20th century. He studied at the University of Freiburg, where he completed his PhD thesis in 1922. And then in 1929, he returned to Freiburg to write a habilitation with Heidegger. Martin Heidegger, you might know of as one of the greatest German philosophers of the 20th century, his most famous book being Being in Time. Being in Time was published in 1928, and upon reading this, Marcuse wanted to go and work with Heidegger. A habilitation is a second PhD thesis, and you have to write this in Europe to earn a professorship, so a full professorship at a university. But of course, not all things were good in Germany in the 20s and 30s and going into the 40s, and Marcuse was from a Jewish background. And so in 1933, he first joined the Institute for Social Research, which is called the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and he began to work with them, but they had to immigrate from Germany to the U.S., and Marcuse joined them in that immigration. Here we're talking about such figures not only of Herbert Marcuse, but Theodor Adorno, who is known for his work in music and dialectics, and also Max Horkheimer, who is known as the leader of the Frankfurt School and worked with Adorno to produce the famous work Dialectic of Enlightenment. Marcuse during this time is trying to secure a permanent standing with the Institute in exile, but the Institute has to be careful about where its money goes, and so he has to find other employment. And to do that, he works with the Office of Strategic Services. This was an office started with the Second World War I'm talking about, and he's working on propaganda with Germany and Nazi Germany, and he's trying to also understand Nazi Germany from a strategic side in order to help the U.S. and its allies win the Second War. This work continues after the war, particularly with the propaganda and the development of democracy in Germany, but things change at the national federal level, and he has to leave that office and find employment elsewhere. Before he started working for the Office of Strategic Services, though, he did earn his U.S. citizenship in 1940, and he remained in the United States as a citizen until he died, even though he traveled all over the world. Other members of the Frankfurt School returned to Germany after the war and reestablished the Institute for Social Research. In 1952, he earned university teaching, first at Columbia and then at Harvard, and then he had an extended period from 1954 to 1965 at Brandeis University, where he taught one of his most famous students, which was Angela Davis. In 1965, because of uprisings at the Brandeis University, he moved to University of California at San Diego, and he worked there until his death, again in 1979. But during this time period, he's not only teaching in San Diego, but he's also become very important to the student movement, and he's known as the grandfather of the New Left. Now, we want to be careful there because this is not a title that Marcuse really wants to latch on to, even though he thinks that it's important to understand and to engage with and to support the student revolutions and everything else that's going on in the 60s. But he also wants to have some possibility of being critical of it. And so he has this sort of difficult, well, not difficult, but this relationship with the student movement and with the left in the 60s and trying to support it, and in many ways is very inspirational to the New Left. He's also part of the break in the political New Left in England and across Europe and the English-speaking world, with the divide between the New Left that is focused on the proletariat as the source of revolution, and the New Left that's looking at student movements, third world revolutions, and other marginalized revolutionary bodies like the women's movement or the Black Panther movement. So he becomes this dividing figure in some ways for the New Left as a political group, but also he becomes this leader, this sort of guru to the student movement and to many others in the 60s, particularly because of some of the work that he does. One of the fun facts I like to kind of point out here about Marcuse is that he is a national figure, so much so that a guy named Michael Horowitz, who was a former student of Marcuse at Brandeis, is able to publish what he calls a portrait of the Marxists as an old trooper in such an established magazine as Playboy in September 1970. And I just want to look at a couple of quotes from this article just to kind of give you a flavor of a different take on Marcuse. This is not the general take that many people would have on the left of Marcuse, and certainly can be challenged in many ways. But I think that looking at what Horowitz, who is a sympathetic critic of Marcuse, can be instructive for how we want to approach Marcuse. So Horowitz writes that wrong Marcuse may often be, but never dead wrong. His revolutionary broadsides have always been too delightfully apocalyptic to be anything but explosively alive. It is Marcuse's very vivacity that renders his outlandish dialectic so palatable. In brief, the philosopher sees history as an endless confrontation between reason and imposed ignorance. To hear Marcuse tell it, reasonable men would automatically agree on everything from equal distribution of wealth to bisexual orgies if it weren't for the professor's version of the blue meanies, fat cat power elitists who've been hoarding everything for themselves since the Stone Age. And this paragraph goes on for a little bit, but he ends this paragraph, which is part of a larger piece, with this. The hope is for the victory of reason through a student worker revolution that will be, in the words of Marcuse's students, just as violent as the violence it combats, end quote. So here's one kind of encapsulation of Marcuse that was touted at the time of the 1970, after 1968, after our great adventure at Woodstock, and really turning into the 70s and a different kind of revolutionary period, but still a sort of revolutionary period for many people. If I can just follow up here for a second, this is written in 1970, and Marcuse has already published most of his major philosophical works that are inspirational for the movements of the left. So One-Dimensional Man and Eros and Civilization. And it's One-Dimensional Man that's very apocalyptic here, that looks towards the end of civilization as we know it. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But that's one of the ideas that we see about Marcuse is this sense that the world is going to end if we don't do something soon. The idea that the revolution will be violent is deep rooted in parts of Marxist revolutionary theory. You can even see lines of this in Marx and his collaborator Engels. On the other hand, Marx and Engels are both very careful to say that the revolution cannot be led by a vanguard. It has to come from the people themselves, forming a new consciousness. And Marcuse struggles with this idea, I think, throughout much of his work. Who are the leaders of the revolution? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But you have this very kind of strident person on the stage here, who's explosive, who's alive, and who can be outlandish in many ways. But the core of his ideas, and we'll see this in a slide from now, the core of his idea is this contrast between reason and ignorance. And those of you who have studied Kant's Enlightenment, or what is Enlightenment, know that this goes back to the Enlightenment period, that human beings are torn between this kind of self-imposed ignorance and the possibility of enlightenment and reaching freedom. And Marcuse is playing with that very idea and trying to look towards the student revolutionary, as well as the worker, as well as other marginalized groups, as grasping part of reason's drive to freedom. Perhaps one of the best ways to get a sense of this is to understand what's going on with one of his major students, Angela Davis, who was a member of the Black Panthers, who was wanted by the FBI for a while, but was then freed, partly due to Marcuse's intervention, and who still speaks today about Black radical movements, and is very supportive of Marcuse and takes a lot of her inspiration from Marcuse. And so I invite you to just watch the video that's included here. So pause the narration on the PowerPoint and watch the video to just get a sense of how Davis herself thinks about and reflects on Marcuse. And this is a quite different kind of take than you get with Horowitz, who was sympathetic but also questioned a lot of Marcuse's ideas. So I invite you now to then look at or listen to this video of Angela Davis. Marcuse was prolific throughout his career. He's published hundreds of articles. I want to look at some of the major books that he wrote. 1932, Hegel's Ontology and Theory of Historicity, his first book. 1941, Reason and Revolution, an Introduction to the Dialectical Thinking of Hegel and Marx. So this is a reevaluation of his ideas about Hegel. Hegel, you may know as a German philosopher of the 19th century, early 19th century, that comes after Kant, and that sees a contrast in history between spirit and freedom, and sees history as a progressive unfolding of freedom in history. And so